Our scripture reading today is from Romans chapter 9, verse 30 through chapter 10, verse 4. What then are we to say? Gentiles who did not strive for righteousness have attained it, that is, righteousness through faith. But Israel, who did strive for the righteousness that is based on the law, did not succeed in fulfilling that law. Why not? Because they did not strive for it on the basis of faith, but as if it were based on works. They have stumbled over the stumbling stone, as it is written, "See, I am laying in Zion a stone that will make people stumble, a rock that will make them fall, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame." Brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. I can testify that they have a zeal for God, but it is not enlightened. For being ignorant of the righteousness that comes from God and seeking to establish their own, they have not submitted to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. For most of his ministry, the Apostle Paul was flummoxed. If you know anything about the Apostle Paul, you would know that he was a very righteous Jewish Pharisee who had a transformative experience with the risen Jesus. This encounter changed his entire understanding of God and God's grace, and he became convinced that the love of God and the steadfast mercy of God was not only for his own Jewish people, but for the entire world. We sometimes forget just what a revolutionary idea this was, and how it challenged much of what Paul had previously believed. But what leaves him flummoxed is that as he goes about telling about the good news of God in Jesus Christ, his resurrection from the dead, it is mostly Gentiles, non-Jews, people who know nothing about Abraham or Moses and the commandments. They've got no ties to Jerusalem and David. They've never celebrated the Passover. These people hear of Christ's resurrection from the dead, and they want to be baptized and join the church. Meanwhile, his own faith kin largely do not accept his message and turn to Jesus, despite Paul's best efforts to show its congruence with what's written in the Hebrew Scriptures. And that leads the apostle to ask some very important questions about the nature of God and God's promises. Does this mean, because Israel hasn't turned to Christ, that God has abandoned Israel? Has the old covenant with Abraham simply been replaced by the new covenant signified in baptism? If that is the case, what does that say about God as one who makes promises? That God makes a promise, but then after time, God might change his mind and renege on that promise? And if God would replace the covenant with Abraham with the covenant of the cross and baptism, who's to say that Jesus' resurrection and that promise of grace is trustworthy either? What if God decided to change his mind about that too? All of Romans chapters 9 through 11 deals with that core question. We're only reading a few verses of that section today. And in the section that we're looking at today, Paul uses the image of a race to show the conundrum that he's in. Imagine with me for a second that you're at a race. You see all the runners there. They're thin, chiseled bodies. They've got their short shorts on. They've got their wicking shirts. Their numbers are carefully pinned to their shirts. They have on their smart watches to track their splits. They've got on their mirrored sunglasses. They're eating bananas and doing their stretches. And finally, the gun fires and they take off. You go to the finish line to see who's going to come out of this race on top, who's going to be in first place. You have some suspicions based on what these runners looked like at the starting line. But then lo and behold, over the horizon comes this pasty fella who doesn't even have a bib number on. He's wearing a cotton t-shirt and a headband and cargo shorts. It doesn't look like he'd even known to sign up for the race. And he looks as surprised as you do as he accidentally stumbles across the finish line. And the race organizers, they shoot off all the confetti and they say, "We have a winner!" That's kind of what Paul is describing when he writes in these verses. Gentiles who did not strive for righteousness have attained it. That is, righteousness through faith. They weren't even registered for the race. They just got on the course in the middle of the event and then trusted the invitation to join up and came across the finish line, declared the winner. There was no obedience. There was no works that brought them that. And then you hear the contrast that Paul then voices. But Israel, who did strive for the law of righteousness, did not attain the law. Now that's not exactly the parallelism you were expecting, is it? You would think that Paul would say they did not attain righteousness. But Paul says instead they did not attain the law. The apostle here is alluding to the notion that his faith can have equated law-keeping with righteousness. And if you make law-keeping and righteousness synonymous, you've eliminated the place of faith. And Paul is very insistent that even in the covenant with Abraham, even in his own Jewish faith, faith itself comes before obedience. Righteousness comes simply through a trust in God. Obedience is our expression of that trust. That righteousness of faith, therefore, becomes the stumbling stone to trip over. And Christians, in our arrogance, have often said, "What's wrong with these people? Why don't they understand this?" I'm going to ask us to hold that posture for a minute, because I think we all struggle with the righteousness of faith. We all like laws. Maybe not laws about mixed fibers in a fabric or not eating shellfish or how many bulls to bring to a sacrifice. But we all like rules and parameters so that we can prove by our behavior that we are part of the good people. So we do our own fair share of stumbling, tripping over the righteousness of faith. Maybe you know about the British Olympic runner. His name is Derek Redmond. Redmond's career was one of striving after righteousness, the righteousness that would come from winning an Olympic medal. His entire worth was based on his performance in his athletic prowess. But his training was marred by injury. Even though he was part of teams that won multiple medals at world championships, he had to withdraw from the 1988 Olympics in Seoul 90 seconds before his event because of a torn Achilles tendon. By the time the 1992 games came up in Barcelona, Redmond had undergone 8 surgeries related to his injuries. He had striven after righteousness and he had stumbled time and time again, but he hadn't quit. He'd gotten back up, he'd gotten to the line, the 1992 games in Barcelona. He was running the 400-meter event. And in his first round, he had the fastest time of all of the competitors, which put him in a great spot as he entered the semifinal heat of that day. takes off in strong form. But then you see it. Hamstring. He collapses to the track, devastated. He has failed yet again. See the other runners zooming on, completing their heat of the race. And at this moment of the story, you could think, what a waste of all this time and energy and effort. What wasted years to come to this point. He had striven after righteousness, but he had not attained the law. You've been there. Not just Derek Redmond, not just the people of Israel and the righteousness of faith. There's been some goal, some performance in your life, and you said, if I can just get that goal, or if I just perform, then I'm going to be worth it. And you didn't reach the goal. You didn't perform like you needed to. For some folks, that absolutely crushes their spirit. Because if your worth is based upon how you perform, and you do not perform the way you expected to, then what are you worth? But Derek Redmond is remembered 30 years later in Olympic lore because of what happened in the next moments on that track. Tries to do it on his own, hobbling around the track. At least let me finish, but he can't. And so his father breaks through the security line and runs out to his son, holding him as he's racked with sobs. He accompanies his son around the track and makes sure that he gets to the finish line, something Derek could not have done for himself. Now, if you go to the record books of the 1992 Olympic Games, you look up the name Derek Redmond, and you look up the 400-meter race that he was running. Next to his name, it says in the record books, did not finish. Because his father broke through the security guards and waving them off that what he was doing was against the rules, Derek was disqualified from the race by the standards of righteousness set by the Olympics. Did not finish. But what Derek Redmond learned that day is that he has a father who will break through every boundary to get to his son, to make sure that he knows that his worth is not based in his performance on the track, but in the very fact that he is one who is able to walk this earth. Even a mark that read, did not finish, cannot claim his son's truest identity. Friends, that's what God in Jesus Christ has done for us. God has broken through every barrier that would keep us to God, to come to us when we have collapsed on the track, realizing that we will never attain the life that we thought we could get that would make us whole. God comes to us in Jesus Christ. He takes our sin and the sin of the world on himself as he dies on a cross, and he rises to new life so that he can carry us to the finish line. He is our righteousness. He is our faith. The record books on you and me might say did not finish, but we trust the one whose arms were splayed on a cross, who cried out to God, "It is finished." Because of Jesus Christ, all striving after our own righteousness is finished. And so even though that feels like a stumbling block, it is in fact the good news. And it begs the question for all of us: what would you strive for if you were no longer defined by your striving?